你们好，สวัสดีค่ะทุกคนКак у всех дела? Bonjour.
Welcome back to Evolve. Today we have my ex-colleague from the UN, Daria, a polyglot from Russia, now a PhD candidate at Chulalongkorn University in demography. The big question we always ask our polyglot guests, how many languages do you speak?
Okay, Russian is my native tongue. Then we have English, Thai, Mandarin, Chinese, and I learned French.
Et pas français aussi, hein. Avant, on a parlé ensemble.
Ouais,
C'est
ouais,
validé. Yeah, it's incredible. I've even witnessed your journey firsthand, from being able to communicate in Thai to seeing you have full fluency now. So could we hear a bit of those languages? Maybe a little introduction in each one?
Здравствуйте. Как у всех дела? Меня зовут Дарья. Спасибо друзьям за то, что пригласили меня на этот подкаст. สวัสดีค่ะทุกคนหนูชื่อดาริยาชื่อเล่นดาราอยู่ที่ประเทศไทยมากกว่า5 ปีแล้วก็ตอนนี้เรียนปริญญาเอกที่มหาวิทยาลัยจุฬาลงกรณ์เรียนสาขาประชากรศาสตร์ค่ะยินดีที่ได้รู้จักทุกคนนะคะ你们好我叫莎莎我是俄罗斯人但是我学中文在大学我学3年了 Bonjour je m'appelle Daria enchantée
Enchanté, ça fait plaisir. So for those out there who would also want to speak languages fluently like you, what advice would you give to them? How were you able to learn to speak those languages so well?
For me, it was more out of necessity and maybe out of wanting to fit in because I moved to Asia quite young and I felt like I should speak the language so that I can feel more like at home. You know, because when you live somewhere for a very long time, you cannot be a guest forever, right? You have to kind of try to assimilate yourself. And then it takes work, such as knowing the language. I feel like it's the most important part.
Could you try and break it down into steps then? That when you say you moved to Asia, was Thailand the first country?
Yeah, Thailand was the first country. So even though I began by studying Mandarin, I've never been to China. I just moved to Thailand.
That said, there's a huge Thai-Chinese community here, but they mostly speak the Dechio dialect anyway. Yeah. So this is extremely impressive. But okay, let's start with Thai. You arrived to Thailand. What was the actual process of getting from like ground zero to this level of fluency that you have now?
I arrived here, and when I first arrived here, I had to learn English first because my English from Russian small town was quite poor. I had to accustom myself to English, and then it took maybe 1 or 2 years. I learned that, and then I moved to Thai. I actually tried to learn it a couple of times when I was younger, but then was so hard, so I kind of gave up for a bit. But then after a few times of trying to learn it and trying to go to school or speak with my friends or learning by myself and giving up, you kind of on maybe the 4th or 5th try, you feel like, oh, maybe something is left over there. So it gives you more motivation to continue.
That's a great message of perseverance. So, but were you studying formally? Like, did you have classes? You said you're in a school, inside and out of the classroom. What's your like approach to learning a language?
Yeah. So at first, I think I picked basic Thai up just from my friends or from being outside. And then I felt like, okay, I'm going to take a shortcut, do the easy way. I'm going to go to language school and they're going to do it for me and teach me Thai. And then I go there. Yeah, for some time it was useful. But with Thai, the challenge is getting past like upper beginner level, sort of getting to intermediate and beyond. And I feel like in a school, it's quite challenging to do this because most people who come to study Thai, they just want the basics. And that's kind of what all the schools and the books are geared towards. So then I stayed in the school for some time, but then it doesn't go beyond a certain level. So I felt like I had to kind of try by myself. And it was trial and error because there are not that many books for Thai. So I just take a text and Google Translate it and make myself Anki cards and the Anki app and just try to read some kind of kids books for Thai or watch a Thai show. Pick out in the subtitles what I don't understand. So you try to watch it for the first time and then you feel so discouraged and sad because you don't understand 90%. And all of the subtitles are highlighted, but then you watch the same thing again and it's, better already.
Anki app? What's that?
Anki app is just like a free computer app where you just make flashcards. I think lots of language learners, they maybe use Anki.
Okay, so
Yeah.
it sounds like you just took a lot of self-initiative after you've got the basics. And I always tell people as well that there's certain things like the grammar, learning that in an academic environment is very useful, but out of the classroom is where you're going to get the real essence of the language. As you said, out and about with Thai people, and then going on watching movies, seeing how people speak in a natural environment. So how long did it take then? Like you're in the school for what, a year or how long? And then what were the steps like after that to you start speaking it and then you got to that fluency level?
My journey was a bit non-linear, so I cannot say if I was in a school for a year, because it was like, okay, I'm going to go for a few months when I'm more free, and then I get busy and I kind of give up, quit school after a few months. And then the next year I'm going to go back for a few months, try again, maybe the same level or a bit higher than that. Most of the learning for me, it was not out and about necessarily, maybe just in my room. I would get the word and I would write it like 100 times so that I can remember the spelling and how it sounds. Yeah, I feel like for me, it was mostly just me sitting there and learning.
Would you consider yourself an introvert?
Yeah, I think so.
This is a prime example of the difference between how an introvert learns a language and how an extrovert learns a language, because I was obsessed with being outside and asking people, how do you say this? How do you say this? How do you say this? Whereas your process, it sounds like you were memorizing it through flashcards, but both worked. So it really depends on you. As long as you've got that perseverance and kind of obsession, you'll get there. So how did that then translate into actually being able to converse with people though? Because memorizing a word in your bedroom and having a conversation with someone is very different. So how did that happen?
I tried to stall going outside and interacting with people and making the error for as long as possible, because I'm kind of I was a straight A student, so it's hard to make an error and accept it and move on. It's kind of painful. So I try to, stall going out and actually interacting and like using the language fully. Maybe I would talk with my friends who I was sure would get me, and it was a safe environment. But then at some point you have to go into the real world and talk to people who might not be receptive or not understand your accent, or, actually interact with real people. You must venture out at one point.
I really like what you said there about having close people who you can like make mistakes around. Because of course, I'm very extroverted. For me, I don't mind making mistakes in front of people because I see every mistake as an opportunity to learn. And in language, that's essential, in my opinion, of if you don't speak, you're not going to be able to improve. So you have to be able to make mistakes at some point. But of course, having close people who can correct you and you don't mind correcting you really accelerates that. So did you have people around you like Thais who eventually you felt comfortable making mistakes in front of? Or did you just did you lose that perfectionism around a few certain people, or how did it work?
At first, yeah, I had my friends who I could practice with, and it was kind of a safe space to practice because I didn't experience, harsh corrections or just plain misunderstanding, and people switch to English, it hurts your ego. At some point, you have to take the risk and learn to be wrong. Yeah. There is no way to learn a language and completely never get your ego or feelings bruised.
There's a great quote that I saw that confused me at the start, which was, the quickest way to increase your success is to double your rate of failure. And when I first saw that, I was really confused. How? What? But then the more mistakes you make on the way, the more opportunities you will have to just accelerate your learning from each one of those. It's a key difference here. You can see introvert, extrovert. I worked in a language school language schools in London for over 5 years in different schools. And you would find that a lot of the East Asian students would arrive with a very high level of grammar. So the base level that a lot of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean students arrived in the UK with was higher than, let's say, the average Latino student who arrived in the UK. But after a few months, those Latino students were completely fearless to approach people and to obsessively speak English. So after a few months, those Latino students' level of English actually became superior. Maybe not always grammatically, but in terms of their confidence to speak. Whereas some of the Asian students, because of the culture, were very shy and reserved to, they felt like it was offensive to make mistakes in English when speaking to us. Which obviously, like some of my Colombian, Mexican friends, they didn't think like that. We can learn from each other, and that some of those Latino students I worked with, diligently studying grammar can be useful. But if you're not out there sometimes speaking, it can be really difficult to improve.
The beginning of last year, I went to South America with basically no Spanish. And I still remember the feeling of saying, okay, I'm going to have that confidence, but I know that I'm not going to be able to really say much. And that feeling where you start a conversation and you just know that it's not going to go very far because you don't really have much language, but you do it anyway. Can you comment on, do you remember when you switched from that way of feeling about your Thai to when you thought, actually, no, I do back myself. I can go and have that conversation, and whatever they throw at me, I feel like I'll be able to communicate with them. How long did that take you?
I feel like I made the switch just when I grew up, when I became more comfortable in my own skin, then I could make the switch. At one point, you have to accept, I guess, that you are going to be a foreigner no matter what. Yeah, because I come to a culture where I didn't grow up in and I look different. And my Thai is not like a native speaker. It's not going to be perfect. I don't think there is a way I could absolutely blend in. And once you accept it, then you can actually improve paradoxically.
The theme here is that you must practice.
Yeah.
Like you must do the groundwork of learning words, doing the flashcards, but then you also must go and kind of surf the waves, make the mistakes. Do you feel like there's anything else that people need to add to that to successfully learn a language? Was that pretty much the blueprint?
Well, I have two. One is, as Hakim mentioned, that underscores every other point, is persistence. You have to try again and you have to stick to it. It's with everything. It's not unique to languages. And I think one unique to languages would be you have to fall in love with the culture at least a bit so that you can learn the language. I feel like if you don't really love the culture and you're not that interested in the culture, then the language is not going to come. And I feel like my fluency in different languages is quite proportional to my love or obsession.
I find that very interesting considering you said you've not been to China.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about your love for Thai culture?
I wouldn't have stayed here so long if I didn't like Thai culture. In terms of particularly what things I like, it's hard to pinpoint when you've been somewhere for so long, since you were a teenager or something like that, because you are so used to it. People are quite considerate, kind. The attitude is quite different from what I was used to in Russia. I feel like people are quite a bit colder. So this type of environment, I think it certainly helps to learn the language when people are really, encouraging sometimes and receptive.
I really want to highlight what you said about how culture and language should not be seen as separate things when you approach learning a language. And it really depends on the context though, because English, for example, we're British. English is used to communicate as a language, like for people from all over the world. They might not necessarily care about English culture, British culture, and all of those things. However, when you do take that extra step to learning about someone's culture, rather than just using the language as a communication tool, I always say with Thai people, like you take one step to Thai people, they'll take 1,000 steps back to you in terms of they want to share the culture with you. They want to help you learn and feel comfortable in their culture. And it is the same with British people as well, that, okay, you can communicate to us. I like to say like robotically by using words. But then when you show an awareness of our culture, which includes sarcasm, like we did an episode actually about breaking down British culture, when you're aware of those things, of course, instinctively, we're going to want to welcome you more. Little things. I mean, in Korea, people often ask, like, how do you say, how are you in Korean? And literally, you might say like, 잘 지내, or like, 잘 지냈어요? Like, how have you been? But Koreans never ask that because culturally, asking someone how they are in many cultures is seen as too invasive. So they'll ask, like in Thai, right? How have you eaten? have you eaten rice? These things we've discussed as well on other podcasts. And it's just an awareness of that. When you fall in love with those nuances between each culture, it doesn't become work. It becomes something you want to do instinctively. You don't get tired at the end of the day because you love listening to the music. You love reading the novels. And that's something we're going to ask you about, maybe the literature and movies and music, those things I know you're passionate about as well. So
yeah, Hakeem, about the culture, it was a really good point. For me, especially, I think the novels and the comics and the movies and the music play a really big part in making me want to learn the language more, because I'm quite a nerd. So I like art. I like getting really deep into a show, or especially fantasy sci-fi series. I feel like with English, it made a really big difference. I know that English is not that impressive, but for me, it was also a journey to learn it. And I feel like what really made it is that I read my favorite fantasy series in the original language, and I had the desire to get into the different fan forums and theories, and they're all in English. So I felt like I kind of have to translate and do the work. But then at some point you were kind of like, no, I don't need the subtitles. And you go deeper into the community already as someone who has the confidence of someone who would be a native speaker. For Chinese, I really enjoyed the culture as well. Actually, originally it was my parents who wanted me to learn Chinese. Originally, it wasn't my idea. So it was the opposite. It's not like I sought the language out because I liked the culture, but the love for the culture was more of a byproduct from learning the language. I really enjoy Chinese TV shows or some of the light novels sometimes, but actually there are a few that I read in the original language, because with Mandarin Chinese, I actually got to HSK 4. But then learning languages simultaneously, I feel like with Thai, the more I learn it, it kind of displaces my Mandarin. So it's difficult to compartmentalize. Sometimes nowadays, when I speak Mandarin Chinese, Thai words come into my mind when I'm looking for the Chinese word. So it's like on the tip of my tongue is going to be the wrong word, and I get so frustrated. For Thai, I don't really get that because I feel like I'm already more fluent in it, that it doesn't do that. But for me, because I learned these languages simultaneously, I felt that they are kind of blended in my mind a bit, because some of the structure for the sentences is very similar. Some of the words are going to be the same. So for some reason in the brain, it gets blended together.
Yeah, it's interesting because I know Thailand is its own unique language, but when you break it down, a lot of the words come from Sanskrit. But when you hear the tones, ma, 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 ma. As someone who has a basic level of both of those languages, I can't really distinguish. They sound really similar. And you hear like, wo yao, ow. Some of these similarities between certain words. Did you come across a lot of those crossover words with Mandarin and Thai, or did they seem quite different when you were studying them?
There are a few crossover words, but actually not that many that come to my mind. I feel like when you go to intermediate levels, there are very few crossovers, or at least they don't come to my mind. But about the tones, interesting. I'm going to tell you my secret is that I often ignore the tone, because when I learn the word, I just feel like I try my best to pronounce it like I usually hear it pronounced, and I ignore the tone. And it got me into so much trouble over the years. Even now, sometimes I say something and people are like, what? And they're like, that. And they're going to correct my tone. But I feel like ignoring the tone sometimes has been my saving grace as a Russian, where we don't have tones at all. I feel like, I just try my best to pronounce it by feeling, not by memorizing the exact tone.
That said, Thai people, you got to be careful, because if you miss out, some words can have a completely different meaning. But let's not go too deep into that. But yeah, there are a lot of, like, in Hindi and Urdu, a lot of similar words with Thai. But you wouldn't realize it because the tone makes it sound different. Like, do you know how to say moon? It's a random word. I know. Like the moon. Like in the sky.
Chan.
Like in Hindi and Urdu, they say like chand. Like, so you can kind of see the same origin there. And then for, you see a lot of in like Thai, like Raja Tewi, Raja Damnan. Do you know what the Raja refers to?
I think it's the king.
Exactly. Cause, in India and Pakistan, they use the word Raja for king. And you colloquially, like friends might call like, he's the Raja Sahib, like he's the king. And the word for night, do you know how to say like good night in a formal way in Thai?
Tatri sawat.
Yeah, like rat. Ratri, rati, rat in Urdu as well, night.
How do you say beautiful in Thai? I forgot the word, but there's a, do you know how to say beautiful?
Swai.
What one?
Swai.
Soi. Doesn't that also, if you pronounce it with the wrong tone, mean cursed?
Yeah, I think I just pronounced it with the wrong tone because I said I ignored the tones prior.
But as a Mandarin speaker, you hear the resemblance between swai and han shuai. You know, so this is where it gets confusing because you would call a man shuai in Chinese to mean handsome. But then in Thai, swai is used for women. So it's quite confusing.
This has been a very interesting talk of etymology of words and the connection between different words. How did you go from learning Thai to then learning Mandarin? You mentioned that sometimes you would cross wires with the words. I learned Arabic and then later on I learned Spanish. And sometimes when I'm trying to speak one of them, mainly Arabic, Spanish just creeps into my head and it's really annoying. How did you deal with that? And yeah, can you tell us your process for people who want to also speak multiple languages?
I feel like for me, it's still a work in progress. So currently, I feel like my Thai has quite displaced my Mandarin. And my Mandarin is a bit out of practice. So I don't really have a problem that my Mandarin comes back to displace my Thai because I feel like Thai has sort of monopolized my mind. But I feel like if I went to China and I could use my Mandarin more, maybe it would come out of being dormant and then my Thai would come back to displace it. So I don't know. Maybe the comments can advise us what to do.
But did you go through the same process? So you started with flashcards and so on with Thai and then you ventured out into the world and practiced. Did you do exactly the same thing for Mandarin?
Well, for Mandarin, I feel like for a long time I studied in a school or university setting. So I never actually ventured out that much. I have a few Chinese friends that I can speak Mandarin with, but I never actually had the proper real world Mandarin experience.
Thai as well, they say like for time, something like where,
Vela.
And in my mum's dialect of Punjabi, har wele or har wela means like all the time. And that's not like standard Hindi or like that's their dialect that they use. This like wele, wela also means time. So I really like looking at the distant cousins when it comes to languages. And when Jack mentioned Spanish and Arabic as well, many people often don't make the connection between Spanish and Arabic even. That why is Spanish the only European language that has this ha or jota sound or hala sound compared to a lot of other European languages that don't have that sound? When you trace back the history of Arabic rule in Spain, you can identify a lot of these common words. And you hear Arabs often say inshallah, which Jack, of course, knows means like God willing. Ojalá in Spanish has a pretty similar meaning of like, I hope. You know, ojalá que sea posible. I hope that it's possible. Jack, do you know the word for pillow in Spanish, for example?
I'm sure it's almohada.
Yeah, exactly, which comes from the Arabic almohada.
Daria, are there any similarities between Russian and any of the languages you have learned? Do you have any examples at all?
For English, yeah, I feel like Russian got quite what we call Americanized. Yeah, so we have lots of borrowed words from English. That's obvious. I think that's every language. With French, there are a couple words that come to my mind, which are the same because before, I think in like the 1800s or something, for Russian aristocracy, it was very trendy to speak French. So there is actually a really funny one that I know. In Russian, when we have a slang for bathroom and it's sartir, it's actually quite a slang word. It's quite rude to say. And why do we have this slang? Because while the Russian nobles, they would have like dinners together in their estate and they would speak French. And then they were like, can I go out? I'm going to go out. And they would be like, say the word sortir. And then the servants thought that sortir means the bathroom or the toilet. So now in Russian, sortir is slang for toilet or bathroom.
I think that what you mentioned there about the aristocracy in the UK was the same. The courts and the aristocrats would speak French. And that's why a lot of formal English for French people is really easy to understand. Words that most British people, unless they're academics, would use. French people are very familiar with words like, for example, mordant, mordant. You know, there's a lot of these old French words that originate from Latin and whatnot that are part of the very academic English. So, Daria, spasiba. Thank you so much for sharing your insight today. One final question though. What is your final advice for someone who wants to become a polyglot like you?
Pick a culture that you really love and then you can be ready to commit to long term. And my second piece of advice is to persevere. And the third piece of advice connected to the second is even if you give up, even if you feel like you have to take a break, it's fine. Don't beat yourself up because maybe in a few months or in a few weeks, you can come back to it, you know. If you gave up once, doesn't mean it's over for you. If you have a language which you feel like you forgot and you want to come back to, it's never too late because you put in so much work and it's still there. Yeah.
Amazing. Final message in Thai and Chinese that you'd like to say?
ขอบคุณมากค่ะทุกคนจริงๆน่ายินดีที่ได้มาพอดแคสต์นี้วันนี้ก็มีประสบการณ์สนุกจังเลยค่ะ
สนุกจังภาษาจีนได้ไหมครับ
ภาษาจีนได้เลยค่ะ谢谢大家希望今天过得很好спасибо всем что послушали этот эпизод подписывайтесь ставьте лайки и оставайтесь, чтобы смотреть следующие серии.